It started with fire. A sudden explosion tore through the calm waters of the Arabian Gulf, and within seconds, flames were visible from the decks of nearby vessels. Sailors watching from a distance reported seeing a fireball rise into the sky. Emergency signals began flooding maritime radio channels, and somewhere in one of the most important shipping corridors on Earth, an oil tanker was burning. Iran's Revolutionary Guard claimed responsibility within hours. Naval forces connected to the IRGC, Iranian officials said, had struck a US-linked oil tanker traveling through the northern Persian Gulf. The vessel had been hit, they said. It was left burning in the water. It was part of their retaliation campaign in the growing confrontation across the region. The announcement was brief. The consequences were not. Before we go any further, it is worth pausing to understand what the Gulf actually is, not as a geographic feature on a map, but as the physical foundation of the global energy system. Every single day, enormous tankers loaded with crude oil move through these waters. Saudi Arabia sends its oil through here, Kuwait, Iraq, the UAE, Iran itself, in different times. The combined flow represents roughly 1/5 of the world's entire oil supply, all of it moving through the narrow Strait of Hormuz before entering the Arabian Sea and continuing toward refineries across Asia, Europe, and beyond. The Strait of Hormuz is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. Through those 33 kilometers moves energy that heats homes in Germany, powers factories in South Korea, fuels trucks delivering food across the United States, and keeps the lights on in cities from Tokyo to Cairo. It is not an exaggeration to say that the global economy depends on what happens in those waters. It is a simple geographic fact. When an oil tanker burns in the Arabian Gulf, the world does not watch from a safe distance. The world feels it in ways that start with energy markets and eventually reach every household that pays an electricity bill or fills a gas tank or buys food at a supermarket. The tanker that was struck began sending distress signals shortly after the explosion. Flames spread across sections of the ship while the crew fought to control the fire and secure what they could. Nearby vessels monitored the situation, unsure whether to approach. Maritime authorities began coordinating emergency responses across a region that was already operating at heightened alert. On trading floors thousands of miles away, the news landed like a stone in still water, and the ripples spread outward immediately. Oil futures began climbing within hours. Shipping companies started reviewing their routes, and insurance underwriters, the quiet professionals whose actuarial calculations determine whether commercial shipping through dangerous waters remains economically viable, began reassessing their risk models. That last point matters more than most people realize. War risk insurance is not optional for ships traveling through contested waters. It is a requirement, and when the risk goes up, the premium goes up with it. When the premium goes up, the cost of moving oil goes up. When the cost of moving oil goes up, that cost travels down the supply chain and eventually arrives at the retail level, at the pump, at the grocery store, on the monthly utility bill, in the form of prices that feel disconnected from anything that happened in the Gulf but are, in fact, directly connected to it. The United States felt the connection almost immediately. Diesel prices surged past $4 per gallon for the first time in nearly 2 years within days of the strike. For most Americans, diesel is a background fact of life, something trucks run on, something they rarely think about directly. But diesel is the fuel that moves the American economy in its most physical and literal sense. The truck delivering produce to your local supermarket runs on diesel. The freight train carrying manufactured goods across the country runs on diesel. The agricultural machinery planting and harvesting the crops that become your food runs on diesel. Farmers, truckers, shipping companies, manufacturers, all of them absorb diesel price increases directly, and all of them eventually pass those increases along. A tanker fire in the Arabian Gulf becomes a grocery bill in Ohio. That is not a metaphor. That is the supply chain, working exactly as designed, in reverse. Energy analysts were quick to describe what comes next if the attacks continue. The Strait of Hormuz is not just important, it is irreplaceable. There is no alternative route that can handle the volume of oil that currently moves through it. The pipelines that bypass the strait have capacity limits. The strategic petroleum reserves that governments maintain as emergency cushions have volume limits. If commercial shipping through the Gulf becomes genuinely dangerous, if tanker crews refuse to sail the route, if insurance companies refuse to cover the risk, if shipping companies reroute their fleets to longer paths that add days and cost to every journey, the global oil supply does not simply tighten. It fractures in ways that take months to repair. Some forecasts published in the days after the strike suggested that oil could approach $100 per barrel if disruptions in the region continued at their current pace. That number is not abstract. At $100 per barrel, gasoline prices in the United States rise sharply. Airlines, which were already operating on thin margins, face jet fuel costs that force them to cut routes and raise fares. Shipping companies raise their rates. Chemical manufacturers, whose feedstocks are derived from oil, face higher input costs that move through to every product made from plastic, rubber, or synthetic fiber. The cascade from one number, $100 per barrel, reaches into corners of daily life that feel entirely unconnected to the Gulf, but are not. The United States Navy has maintained a presence in the Gulf specifically to prevent this kind of disruption. The Fifth Fleet, headquartered in Bahrain, exists in significant part to keep the Strait of Hormuz open and to protect commercial shipping through waters that the global economy depends on. After the tanker strike was reported, naval patrols in the region intensified. Warships began monitoring shipping lanes more closely. Surveillance aircraft scanned the waters for additional threats. The challenge those forces face is genuine and difficult. The Gulf is crowded. Oil tankers, cargo vessels, fishing boats, and military ships all share the same narrow waterways simultaneously. Identifying a threat before it reaches a civilian vessel, in an environment where the threatening assets are small and fast, and designed to be hard to detect, requires exactly the kind of constant vigilance that depletes resources and strains crews over extended operations. That is why tanker attacks have historically been among the most strategically effective tactics available to a weaker military power confronting a stronger one. You do not need to sink the US Navy to disrupt global oil supply. You need to make commercial operators decide that the risk of transiting the Gulf is too high to accept. And you make them decide that not by threatening warships, but by demonstrating that civilian vessels, the tankers and cargo ships and bulk carriers that are not built to absorb weapons, are legitimate targets. The message Iran sent with the tanker strike was not primarily military. It was economic, and it was addressed not to American admirals, but to the boardrooms of shipping companies, the trading desks of energy firms, the finance ministers of oil-importing nations, and the political leaders of every country whose economy depends on Gulf oil flowing freely and predictably. The message was simple. The Gulf is no longer safe for business as usual, and every day this conflict continues, the price of pretending otherwise goes up. For Iran, that message serves a specific strategic purpose. By threatening global energy supply, Tehran creates economic pressure on adversaries and on third parties who would otherwise have no direct stake in the conflict's outcome. Countries in Asia and Europe that import large shares of their oil from the Gulf have no military role in this war, but they have an enormous economic interest in it ending, and economic pressure from those countries on Washington, through diplomatic channels, through market signals, through the specific political pressure that comes from populations facing higher energy bills, is exactly the kind of pressure that Iran's strategy is designed to generate. For ordinary people watching from the sidelines, the tanker strike serves as a reminder of something that peacetime tends to obscure. The global economy is not an abstract system that runs on algorithms and financial instruments. It runs on physical infrastructure, on pipelines and refineries and shipping routes and the people who operate them. And that physical infrastructure exists in the real world, where wars happen and explosions occur and fires burn on the decks of vessels that were, an hour earlier, simply doing their job. The sailors aboard that burning tanker were not soldiers. They were maritime workers, people who chose a profession that involves long months at sea, away from families, in conditions that most people on land never experience. They were doing their job in waters that became a battlefield without their consent and without any meaningful ability on their part to change that fact. Their distress signals reached maritime authorities. Emergency responses were coordinated. The fire eventually was addressed. The investigation into exactly what happened, exactly what was struck, and exactly what the damage amounts to is ongoing. But the impact of what happened does not wait for investigation results to conclude. It is already moving through the system, through oil futures markets and insurance premium tables and shipping route calculations and diesel prices at truck stops across America and grocery prices at supermarkets in cities that are thousands of miles from the Arabian Gulf and have never appeared on any military targeting list. One explosion, one tanker, one fireball visible from nearby vessels in the early hours of an ordinary morning in the Gulf. The ripples are still spreading. Share this with everyone you know. Iran's Revolutionary Guard struck a US-linked oil tanker in the Arabian Gulf. Diesel prices in the United States have already surged past $4 per gallon. Oil could approach $100 per barrel if disruptions continue. 1/5 of the world's oil supply moves through the Strait of Hormuz. The tanker that was hit was carrying that supply toward markets that depend on it. And the question that every energy market, every shipping company, and every oil importing government is now asking is the same question with no comfortable answer. Is this the first strike or the first of many?